Are you ready?
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lennard, and I'm refuting on the claim about the destabilization of Syria will only be solved by U.S. intervention. He has three supporting claims. The first is if the U.S. were involved in the Syrian conflict, their economy will stabilize and increase. The second one, by the U.S. being in Syria, the civilians will settle down on peace once again. The third one is terrorist influence will grow if the U.S. fails to act. These claims as a whole does not support the main claim as why the destabilization will only be solved by U.S. intervention, because there's no claims about how strong the U.S. military is, and there's no claims about some achievements or history in other interventions by the U.S. He actually gave one, but I didn't think it didn't work. So the first claim, if the U.S. were involved in the Syrian conflict, their economy would stabilize and increase. He supported this claim. He claimed that if the U.S. takes back the oil fields and the plants controlled by the terrorists, the economy of Syria will be back on the right direction. And my response to this is, even if the U.S. takes back the oil fields and plants controlled by the terrorist groups, that will not actually stop the civil war happening in Syria, because because control of the resources wasn't actually the reason why there's a civil war in there, and it started about the protests against al-Assad's government. So it doesn't matter if they take back those lands. And CNN News actually stated these terrorist groups are in fight to the death on these lands. So it will only cost us military lives to take back these terrorist-controlled oil fields and plants, and will actually not solve anything. And then his second supporting claim is, by the U.S. being in Syria, the civilians will settle down to peace once again. He supported this with a claim with the U.S. using coalition's airstrike, and he's saying peace, but how can people in Syria be at peace if there's gonna be airstrikes everywhere? And actually, the U.S. did this already. According to the Daily Mail, more than 450 civilians, and including 100 children, have been killed already by the U.S.-led coalition airstrikes against the ISIS. And then his third claim, the terrorist influence will grow if the U.S. fails to act. He supports this with one sample of in the history where they solved a crisis with an intervention. It's in Libya. He supported this claim. He claimed that the Syrian crisis has a death toll of 220,000, and the Libyan crisis has like only 30,000 death tolls. So this big difference, and how can he be sure that helping Libya in their crisis will have the same effect in the Syrian, and the Syrian crisis right now is like 5 times bigger than the Libyan crisis that happened in 2011. And according to the 2011 intervention in Libya, the effort was actually is actually led by France and the United Kingdom. So they're the two countries that has the big intervene with the Libyan crisis. So this sample or evidence doesn't actually help the main claim and the supporting claim. So actually the main claim that's gonna be better for this situation in Syria is the destabilization of Syria will only be solved if the United Nations intervene with this crisis. And that's my speech.
All right, structurally everything's easy to follow. You laid out the secondary claims and you go to them individually, signpost them as you get to those points. The economic issue I think is pretty solid. You basically argue a counterclaim here that the source of the Civil War is something other than control of the resources. I do think you need a little bit more evidence on that particular point. The CNN quote on it being a fight to the death is good, but there's also context that involved what was going on before, and I'm sure that there are plenty of people out there who have speculated what Syria needs to look like with or without Assad. So the notion that it's really just about the control of the oil fields, I think, is a good attempt to dismiss that argument as being not relevant or not particularly important, but it needs to be developed a little bit more. Again, the transition to the second point was pretty clear. The challenge about the effectiveness of airstrikes needs to be sharper. You point out, for instance, that there have been civilian deaths associated with U.S. airstrikes in the area, and so how does that complicate things? What inference do you want us to draw from that? You need to tell us that we can't have these airstrikes be effective because the consequences are too severe to the civilian population. It would create backlash against American intervention because civilians are going to be hurt, something like that. Just as a side note, you ought to point out the fact that the U.S. is not the one who's doing the most airstrikes this week. The Russians got involved over the last few weeks. The situation has changed dramatically, and the idea that the United States conducting airstrikes while the Russians are conducting airstrikes in the same area, that doesn't sound like it's particularly healthy. And I think you're missing an opportunity to make an argument there that would come from doing current research on what's happening right now in that context. And then the terror influence. Basically, this is just a criticism of the analogy to Libya, and I think you've got a legitimate criticism suggesting that they're substantially different. Syria is a bigger problem, that sort of thing. But this is another one of those places where I think if you did a little bit more research, they're trying to use Libya as an example of how things might be effectively intervened and prevent those sorts of things. But I'm not exactly sure the situation in Libya is all that solid, and that would have been one of those things where if you'd done some follow-up research, you might discover that, Gaddafi's gone, and maybe we're not having tons of civilians being killed on a regular basis. There's still a civil war going on there, and basically the government exists in exile. They're not even operating in Libya, so we're supporting a government that's not really functioning in the territory of its own country. So I'm not exactly sure U.S. involvement there is good. But I did like the criticism that you had that, look, it's 5 times bigger in Syria, plus the Libyan intervention was led by the U.K. and France and, not the United States. So we shouldn't be thinking that, our experience here is going to be the basis for making a comparison. I thought that was a pretty good argument. All right, thank you.